powder measuring is one of the areas that I found the most fascinating, but also the most intimidating when I got back into reloading, and that's because of the realization of what incredibly tiny increments you need to accurately measure in. We're all familiar with what a pound is. If we had a pound weight in our hands, we would be able to probably guess that it was about a pound. We all know that there's 16 ounces in a pound, and so from a tactile standpoint, we start thinking of an ounce as being pretty light. An ounce is very tiny and almost difficult to feel. Beyond that, though, going down further, there are drams and grams and grains, and it's extremely important in powder measuring that you know what you're talking about. Now, bullet weights are generally referenced in grains. You'll see 125 grain this, 115 grain round nose, 9 millimeter, 148 grain semi-wad cutter, 38 special, and that sort of thing. Powders are generally referenced in grains as well, but not all of the equipment measures only in grains. So you have to be careful. You have to learn how to use the weighing equipment and how to calibrate the weighing equipment to make absolutely certain you're weighing the correct amount, because the results, again, could be astronomical in terms of the magnified mistake of the effect. Just as an example, in 1 ounce, there are 16 drams. So a 16th of an ounce is a dram, and an ounce is a 16th of a pound. So a dram is a pretty small increment. However, there's 28.39 grams in an ounce. So it's almost half the size in terms of weight of a gram to a dram. When you jump from a gram to a grain, there are 437.5 grains in an ounce. So you're now talking about a magnification of perhaps 20 times greater. 1 gram is approximately 20 times heavier than a grain. Now, for powder purposes, we're measuring to 1/10 of a grain. And so if you figure there's 437.5 grains in an ounce, that means 7,000 grains in a pound, which means 70,000 tenths of a grain in a pound, and you're going to measure to 1/10. So that can be pretty intimidating. However, the most amazing part of all of this is that you can measure that accurately with relative repeatability with a device that costs as little as $25 to $50. This happens to be a balance beam scale that cost me new about $25, and believe it or not, I can measure relatively accurately to 1/10 of a grain. Now, setting these up and using them is not difficult. It just takes a little bit of getting used to and a little bit of caution. There's a balance beam that goes on top of the frame, and there's a pivot point where the balance obviously balances and pivots. There are blades on the back end here that raise and lower between 2 magnets. So they're not touching anything, but there's a slight dampening effect to stop the rocking of the beam. There's a little tray that the powder goes into that hooks on the end of the scale. If we look at the top of the beam, you'll notice 2 things. One is a ball, and the ball, like the old manual weights in your doctor's office, each one of these goes up 10 grains. So if it's down here, you would be measuring between 0 and 9.9 grains. This would be exactly 10 in the next spot, and you'd weigh from 10 to 19.9, and then you'd go to 20, and so on. The other side of this, there's a little wheel that's used for fine-tuning and fine adjusting. Now, if you have a balance beam scale like this, one of the accessories you're really going to need to have is a set of weights that you will use to calibrate your scale. This happens to be the Lyman set. It comes with a pair of tweezers, and it comes with several larger weights. This is 100 grain, 50 grain, 20, 20, and 10. So you can do any combination from 10 to 100. And then there's a little plastic container that includes some tiny little bars. And if you look at the instructions, you don't have to worry about forgetting it. It shows you pictures of the bars. This large 5-sided one is 5 grains. These 2 heavier ones that are bent are 2 grains each. There's a straight bar that's 1 grain, and then there's a very tiny bent bar that's a half a grain. And so you can use these to calibrate your scale. Now, for starters, you need to learn how to set the scale. The instructions that will come with the scale will show you how to do that, but there's a scale on this end of the balance beam, and it simply goes from 0 to 9.9, and then you'd advance to 10, and you would go from 10 to 19.9. The main graduation here is, in this instance, it's a little hash mark over the word grain that shows you're getting to 1 or 2 or 3, and then there's a smaller gradation above it. If you see the little lines that appear or disappear atop the on the top part of the scale, this is your tenths of a grain. So if I wanted to measure exactly 3 grains, I would be here where the hash mark's at the 3, and the hash mark is filled in the 0 spot. So that would be exactly 3 grains. And if I set it there and I push this little button in, it locks that scale in to that position. Now, I would put this back on the balance beam. You have to be sure you're balanced, and you have to be sure your blade is between the two the 2 paddles of magnet on that end, and then you can take this and you can take a 2 grain weight and a 1 grain weight, and that should be 3 grains. And if you look at our scale on this end, the magnets are going to dampen the scale, and it's going to stop right about, it's going to be almost exactly on for 3 grains. It is the tiniest bit under. If you wanted to absolutely fine-tune this to be exactly on, you turn this little adjusting knob, which will move the weight of the knob either in or out in the tiniest of increments to do the absolute fine-tuning. That's extraordinarily close to accurate for 3 grains. So we know this scale. We know if we put powder in that pan, that brings this mark exactly up to even on this end, we know we have exactly 3 grains of powder in that scale, and we could just as easily make it 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.9, 4.5, anything we want, and we would know literally that we are weighing to 1/70,000th of a pound.